and we welcome you here tonight to educate us and let us know some more about this initiative and where we're headed. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Erica. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for coming out on this really difficult night. I really appreciate it. Not sliding on the sidewalk or anything. Great, you're all here. It's wonderful. So one of the first things I'm wondering is, how many of you have fought this fight before? Were you around in the 70s or the 80s? I see a good number of hands going up. And it was a civil rights issue back then, and it is today. It's an issue of individual rights. And as Virginians, we tend to believe in individual rights. We tend to believe in the individual persevering, just like in the Declaration of Independence, right? Against the government, essentially. And so this is an issue that has bipartisan support. We call it nonpartisan, because it's really about allowing individuals to shine through. This is the first time I've used this particular clicker, so we're going to see how it goes. Thank you again, Erica. And the courage to make history. This is going to take courage for our lawmakers and for the citizens who speak with them, but we really believe the time is now. There's a lot of momentum. This is the simple language of the Equal Rights Amendment. You can see on this historic pen, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And really, you see, it's aimed at the government. It doesn't restrict private actors. And that's the first thing that scares a lot of people. They think that they or their business is going to be restricted or subject to new requirements, and it really doesn't. It's aimed at government bodies. And actually here in Virginia, we already have an equal rights provision in our Constitution. So it really won't even restrict our state any more than it already is. On the right, we have this lovely map of the states that have ratified. And here we are in Virginia, and you see we're grouped with the South at the moment. Nevada just ratified last year, and Illinois just ratified this year. So if you went through this in the 70s, you probably know it takes 38 states to ratify a constitutional amendment. Congress passed it overwhelmingly in 1972, and then you need 3/4 of the states to ratify. So here's our timeline. 19th Amendment, when we got the right to vote, Alice Paul and her comrades immediately pivoted essentially to getting women some additional rights. But let's just take a moment to think about that. Women getting the right to vote. Why didn't we already have the right to vote under the Constitution? The Constitution gives people the right to vote, right? But it did. It gave male white landowners the right to vote, and they had to amend it to give women that right. So did we have any other rights after that? Probably not. And that is why we started to work on the Equal Rights Amendment. And they worked and they fought, and you all probably have seen a lot of historic photos, and finally the women's movement in 1972 was passed by Congress. But Congress attached a 7-year deadline to it. And they were doing that a lot with amendments at the time. They were putting 7-year deadlines on ratification. And when that happened, actually one of her fellow activists saw Alice Paul crying, because she knew it would be very difficult to get enough states to ratify. She'd done the counting. She thought about which states they had difficulty in. And a lot of states ratified right away. They were super excited. But even though the deadline was extended until 1982, they only had 35 states. And at that point, it seemed like it had stalled. And a lot of people just thought, oh my gosh, we fought so hard. We didn't get it. Bummer. And they went and they passed statutes and rules, and women were getting empowered, and they were fighting as hard as they could to try and make it work somehow. We have this weird patchwork of rules to try and provide equal rights in our country. And it varies from state to state. It varies between the states and the federal government. It's not consistent. There's not one underlying consistent policy either. But in Virginia, 3 law students at William and Mary Law School wrote a fabulous article saying, wait a second, Congress is just a legislature like any other. If they passed a deadline, why can't they just get rid of the deadline? And hey, maybe they could even count states that ratify in the meantime, because the Supreme Court has decided some cases in which they said that there is a lot of congressional power over the amending process. And so last year, Nevada ratified. We still have the deadline in place, but Nevada went ahead and ratified after an extensive set of committee hearings, and they went around the state. The lawmakers pushed for it very hard. They had counsel advising them all the way, and they did a lovely job, and they ratified. Wow. And then this year, after quite a lot of input and panels, Solicitor General of Illinois used to clerk for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and they had these legal panels and business panels, and all around the state, activists, and Illinois passed it. Illinois ratified it. So if you're doing the math, 35 plus 2 is 37. We need 38 states to ratify. We need one more state. Why did that not be Virginia? All right. So, Virginia, let's make history. We've done this slide. I didn't do this. So, what about the deadline? This is the question on the mind of a lot of people. There's 2 ways a lot of people look at the deadline. The law students who they never talk about it anymore. They did this law review article, but now they have jobs and lives to lead. And they set something huge in motion, but their position was just upheld essentially by Mark Herring, the Attorney General of the state of Virginia, in a letter that he came out with this summer. He said, I can't say that Congress couldn't remove the deadline or extend it. And the other position is, could the deadline be invalid? It's in this, there's like a package around the amendment. It's like a law that contains some extra sort of procedural language, and that most lawyers would say is a law. Can you put a deadline in a law, an amendment? I mean, Article 5 of the Constitution doesn't say anything about deadlines. So some people would argue that the deadline is invalid altogether. Okay. The Attorney General didn't really address that, but it could be the fact. Okay. One thing I'm not sure I dealt with in my slides is there's this extra question which someone may bring up. Some states tried to rescind their ratifications. What does that mean? They rolled it back. They said, yes, women and men can have equal rights. Oh, no, they can't. Vaccines. But the Supreme Court has generally not allowed that to happen. And in fact, for the 14th Amendment, when the 14th Amendment was passed, Congress counted states that had rescinded their ratifications, and that stood the test of time. So, if Congress wants to count states that have rescinded, it is generally widely believed by attorneys that that would be okay. Those rescissions would be invalid. There was a 5th state that tried to sunset its ratification, same issue. Congress has a lot of control over the amending process. If it wants to count the states, it can count the states as having ratified. Okay. 14th Amendment I'll get into in a second. Okay. So we have a lot of history. If you all come and help us lobby in Richmond, or if you talk to your own lawmakers, or whatever it might be, these are some lovely points to make. They speak to Virginia's values. Our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of our Constitution, were largely written by James Madison, based upon the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written by George Mason. We have a lot of Virginia history in amendments, and what was the Bill of Rights all about? It was about preserving individual rights and liberties against potential incursion by the government. So, in our own Virginia Constitution, Article 1 contains an Equal Rights Clause. Wouldn't it be great if we just bring it full circle and bring all individuals within the Bill of Rights? bring women clearly within the Constitution. That's what this is about. We think the federal government should get the same respect for equality that the Virginia government gives. And here's some more talking points. All people are created equal. This is just a basic. America is the greatest nation on earth. Don't we believe in equity? All constitutions, practically, except for us, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, tend to give men and women equal rights. Why are we in company like that? We should really be in company with the other more modern nations of the world. We believe in reasonable checks on governmental power. That is what this is. Some lawmakers say they're worried about federalism. I think it should be. I think their concern is misplaced. I believe this is a check on governmental power, the power to discriminate unreasonably. Okay, and do you own a business? All of the major accounting firms have done studies on this. You know, some of them were worried. What would happen with gender equality and women entering the workforce? And is this good? Is this bad? What would this do? They have shareholders to protect. And Deloitte has done studies. McKinsey has done studies. PricewaterhouseCoopers has done studies. And they have all found that increasing gender equity actually increases gross domestic product and it increases net corporate profits. And that is because you're essentially empowering additional people to become productive. And they've shown actually enormous benefits to the bottom line and to the economy. So also it's great for companies that might want to relocate into Virginia, look at Amazon or look at multinationals. It's more predictable for them, it's more profitable for them if they can follow similar rules here that they would follow in Europe or other countries. Okay, our own state constitution, we talked about this. We've had equality in our own state constitution for almost half a century. Has the sky fallen? I mean, we have equal rights. It's a very clear equal rights provision in the Virginia Constitution. No one has seen anything negative happen. And this speaks to why wouldn't you want equal rights? That's a question I get a lot. What's the opposition? The opposition, I think, is rooted in America that used to be. And I understand that people have nostalgia. Father knows best. There's a bit of a patriarchy in a lot of systems that we have in our world, and I understand that. But not every family is the same. Not every economy is the same. And I think the world has changed, and America has changed with it. Some people might be concerned that additional gender equity would have negative effects because they're worried, that people were worried about unisex bathrooms. Well, guess what? You can go into any McDonald's, and they often have unisex bathrooms. I mean, it's just very common these days. Sometimes you'll see them in airports. It's a family bathroom. North Carolina had to roll back its bathroom law because it was losing companies that were coming to Virginia, and that's an example of the economic effects. Another concern was that women might be drafted. Well, our armed forces are now full of willing female members of our military. One of my favorite members of our coalition is a 10-year veteran of the Air Force. Women are entering the military voluntarily, and thankfully the government doesn't have a draft, and they've never enforced a draft. I mean, fortunately in America, we just haven't had to do that, and so it seems really, really speculative, and at this point we have a ton of female volunteers. So, I would be happy to hear if anyone has other opposition arguments that they're concerned about, and we can do some Q&A after this. All right, so we've gone over this. Longevity, consistency, and justice for all. I'll talk a little bit more about longevity because we really didn't discuss that. So, statutes can be rolled back. Judicial interpretations can be diluted. I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to totally geek out here on you for just a minute. So please humor me. People say, why would this make a difference? Don't we have Equal Pay Acts and some kind of discrimination protections? Why do we really need this? The 14th Amendment, thanks to Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other attorneys at that time, before she became a Supreme Court justice, they brought cases. And they usually had a male plaintiff to try and help the justices put themselves in their shoes. And they did bring a lot of cases, and they persuaded the government to interpret the 14th Amendment as giving us some protection against discrimination. But it's not the highest level of protection against discrimination. Basically, if the government comes up with a decent reason that sounds like it might be okay for the discrimination, reasonably important, then they can discriminate. That's not the highest level of discrimination, which is accorded to racial discrimination or religious discrimination or discrimination based on your national origin or basically any other important protected class. So if you're discriminated against because you were a guy and you adopted a child and brought the child to America and that child is at risk of deportation, you can get discriminated against because you're not the mother. And in the past, there was discrimination if a guy was trying to get benefits as a military spouse. Or my friend Shamali in our coalition was trying to get a government credit card maybe a decade or so ago, and she found out that her credit history when she divorced had entirely gone to her husband, who was a lower rank than her and earned less than her. And that was discrimination pure and simple. She just got caught up in a discriminatory classification. Crazy things happen, much fewer now, but they still occur. So if we have an amendment, that sends a signal. It signals the courts, it signals judges, it signals juries that this is our principle, that we, as the United States of America, believe in equal rights for men and women. If the underlying principles that are in our Constitution help inform judicial decisions, and that makes a difference, and it makes a difference across the board. Okay, I'm going to try and get through this so y'all can ask some questions. Okay, and we are getting through this. Awesome. So, calls to action. Asking Virginia friends who are influential in Republicans' districts to ask some state lawmakers to ratify the ERA. So, that sounds really partisan, but I'm going to explain to you. We actually have Republicans as well as Democrats supporting this legislation. We have to support the Republicans who are supporting it. They need to be able to say, I got this many calls. But it's generally their party that has a little harder time with this. They actually introduced the Equal Rights Amendment originally, and they supported it for years. But then under Phyllis Schlafly, it was sort of rolled back and a lot of these fears arose. So those who are brave enough to support it now again, we really need to help them by giving them calls so that they can tell their comrades, look, I got 100 calls today or this week. Those who are not supporting it yet, we need to pressure them and let them know that their constituents believe in equal rights for all. Make plans to go to Richmond. If you really want to help, this is kind of a fun way. We'd like to get about 400 or 500 people to descend on Richmond on January 9th, wearing the color of the current movement, which is purple. And perhaps if you enjoy that, you can come back for one more day. We can help make appointments with lawmakers, or if that unnerves you, you can just kind of roam the halls. We'll probably have rallies, we'll have get-togethers, happy hours, lunches, dinners, etc. We will be there, we'll be a presence in Richmond. It'll be very peaceful. We've done this in the past. VA-RatifyERA.org is the statewide campaign, and they will be taking sign-ups if you're interested. We have a sort of a NOVA offshoot group, which is this sign up down here, signup.equalrightsva.org, and I believe you all have a handout which has this in it. Let me see now if your fellow could be extra. Yes, here we go. Great. So, he's very good. Yes. So, you might be wondering, what's our legislative strategy? How can we get through this? How can we get the bill through if we haven't gotten it through before? It's passed like a regular bill, even though it's resolutions, and you need one on the House side and one on the Senate side. Here we have the folks on the Senate who are going to be the lead sponsors this year. Glenn Sturtevant is a Republican, Scott Serval is a Democrat, and Rosalind Dance is a Democrat. Glenn Sturtevant is great, and he has committed, he's going to be writing the VA Ratify ERA Plus, which is wrapped in the logo and is touring around the state. Lots of fun. Senator Stewart, who's another Republican, has also done the same, although it's mainly the Democrats who've been writing because they have a little easier time politically, not getting too much pressure when they do this. Okay. There we go. Okay. Jennifer Carroll Foy and Hala Ayala are two of the newest, youngest members, and they've been essentially it's sort of a diverse cast that is bringing this forward into the new millennium. And Jennifer's doing a lot of this riding of the bus and speaking. She came and spoke. We had a law and business symposium discussing the ERA at William and Mary Law School, where this whole idea began. We just had that this weekend. It was fabulous, and Jennifer and also Scott Serval came and talked. They were amazing. But we also had business and legal leaders from around the state. Luke Torian is also on the bill. He's very savvy, and he has a lot of friends on both sides of the aisle. Very nice guy. Am I pointing at it? Should I? Do I?
Point it back this way.
Point it back
Wherever
this way?
wherever the computer is.
Where's the clip?
There you go.
Okay. All right. So there we go. Did I skip one? Okay.
There you go.
All right. Let's get 2 slides in. Yeah. Now within the Senate. We need to get these guys to send it to the floor. What does that mean? The floor is where everyone votes. And you have a floor on the House side, you have a floor on the Senate side. And what's happened in the past is it doesn't reach the floor. If everyone votes, we actually win. We have enough votes between Democrats and Republicans, we will win in both chambers. But they keep the Republican leadership likes to bottle it up in committee. They're a little scared, and we have to get them past this and reassure them that enough people really want this. And that's why the bus tour, that's why the huge momentum this year. Majority Leader Tommy Norman, we've actually heard he may do what we're asking. So I think this is working. We would like him to pass it to Jill Vogel. She is the chair of the Privileges and Elections Committee on the Senate side, and she always sends it to the floor. If she receives the resolutions, the ERA resolutions, she will send it to the floor, and we will get the vote that we need. If Tommy Norman sends it to Brian McDougall, like he did this past session, it will die. It will die a sad and pathetic death. So we're not going to let that happen. But I don't think he's going to do that. So that's his schedule. So we're down to the House. House Speaker Kirk Cox is a very nice guy, and he's a very savvy guy, and he's listening to his caucus, meaning he's listening to the other Republicans. And a lot of the Republicans just saw their districts go a different direction that may want them to go in that direction too to save their seats. They may want to move a little to the center. And this would be good. The ERA is very much a centrist issue, and it's a nonpartisan issue. So this could be very good for them in saving their seats. So we want them to pressure Kirk Cox to send it to his own Rules Committee and not to send it to Mark Cole's Privileges and Elections Committee, where it will die a sad and pathetic death. So that's our strategy. I get to go to Jill Vogel's committee and to Kirk Cox's own committee, and I've probably taken way more time, but I'd like to know, what questions might you have? Did I cover the waterfront? Don't be shy, speak up. Okay, can I bring them the mic? Is it going to be?
I'll be your mic lady.
Okay.
I always wanted to talk to it.
Or if people can come up, maybe, that might make it
Or
easier.
like put form a little line over there. Melissa's like, read the comment and you're a star. Okay. And the next few people who want to ask a question, come on up. This is important. This is our chance.
Thank you for being here. I actually have 2 questions. So my first question is, what do you say to people who say, what rights do you want? Women already have equal rights. Yeah. So that's my first question. And then my second question is, does the language in this account for the trans population who may identify as women, but maybe are not women from birth?
Okay. So those are very good questions. I think the first question is basically answered by saying, in general, we would generally like the same legal rights under our Constitution as men have. And in general, these days, courts tend to give us most of those rights, but under an intermediate level of scrutiny. Because we're not getting strict scrutiny by the courts, what that means is, if there is a discriminatory law it sometimes stands even if it injures people. So there was this case Nguyen where this fellow's son had been adopted. He had adopted him from Vietnam essentially and brought him to the United States. And the kid is basically in deportation limbo. Father doesn't have the same rights as the mother. It's not necessarily that it's only women that need equal rights. Sometimes men do too. There are sometimes really compelling government reasons for discriminatory laws, because biologically, generally, men and women are different. We want the court to only allow laws to stand when there is a compelling reason, not just when there's an excuse, which is what they can do right now. So I recognize that's a very general statement, but I can't possibly list every single, I'd be going through the entire Constitution saying, we like this right and that right. I mean, it would just be clearer if we were clearly within the Constitution. And then your second question is a really great one, because it's very important to a lot of people, and it inspires fear in a lot of people. So ever since Obergefell, which is a recent Supreme Court case, LGBTQ people have had increased rights to marry, and generally, I think a lot of people have gotten over some of their fears. However, there is a good question. If women and men have greater equality, what does that mean for people whose gender might be different, or who may be trans, or have, there's a whole spectrum of identification. And no one can answer that for certain. You're going to love all my questions. All my answers sound like this. No one can answer that for certain, but the amendment is written that there will not be discrimination on the basis of sex. And in legal precedent, sex generally means your biological sex at birth. And so that can be very sticky for trans people. If the courts continue to apply that, it's not going to be very helpful for them. Obviously, LGBTQ supporting organizations are going to be in the courts arguing that it does apply, that it does increase their rights. And some opposing organizations will be in there arguing that it doesn't increase their rights. We can't really predict what's going to happen. So there's going to be some litigation for a while. Bottom line, yeah, we don't know. But the word that is in the amendment is sex, it's not gender. And gender generally means the full spectrum of identification. So, and I would say that I'm very appreciative of religious organizations like this church for enabling us to discuss these issues. These are important issues. And I believe that in general, religious organizations often are and should be supportive of equal rights for all. But in this case, we are talking just about equal rights based on biological sex, I think. We'll see what the courts decide. Other questions? Yes. Can you come forward so you can use the mic?
No, I can speak loudly. Doesn't Congress have to extend the deadline? And if so, what's the lay of the land there?
Okay, so my personal view is I think Congress does have to extend or eliminate the deadline. However, at our symposium at the law school, there was a fascinating discussion. Our last panel was two speakers, one an academic, a law professor, the other one a high-flying law partner who's argued a lot of pro bono cases in this area. Not ERA specifically, but just various discrimination cases. They both really knew their stuff. And the law professor also is a litigator, and she was arguing, we should really go first to the courts and say that the deadline's invalid. And if you all are in Congress arguing that they should get rid of the deadline, doesn't that almost, harm the argument in the courts? Because she said, the opponents of the ERA are going to immediately go to the courts and say that the entire thing is invalid. The deadline was valid, and this ratification is taking place too long after the initial passage, and she said, we've got to be in the courts with our own cases. So that was interesting. And so while she's there, she wants to argue that the deadline is completely invalid because it's not in the active language of the amendment itself, it's just in the law that was wrapped around the amendment, and it's not provided for in Article 5 of the Constitution. So fascinating. Again, guess what? I have no answer. I don't know. We'll see what the courts do, and we'll see what these lawyers do. I know she's going to go to court. She said she's got law students working right now on the cases. It's going to happen. So there will be court cases, but there will also, I believe, be people going to lobby Congress. So yes, that'll happen. And what's going to happen in Congress? Hard to know. Again, there are people on both sides of the aisle who support it. Well, there's legislation right now in Congress. We'll just have to see if the last state ratifies, does that sort of light a fire under them? Do you have a follow-up?
Oh, yeah, is there anything we can do to keep this issue from becoming politicized, a blue team issue, a red team issue?
Yes.
It's our, can't let the other side win on this one.
Right.
Jeez. Any advice on that?
I would love to let the Republicans win on this one. I have to say, I'm feeling very nonpartisan about this issue, but because they control our state legislature and we need their help, I would love to let them win this. If it was the Democrats, I would say the same thing. As far as I'm concerned, every politician needs to think about this as a person. How do they feel about their own family, about their own daughters, their nieces, their cousins? All of them are probably have the average 70% of them are out in the workforce. Don't they want laws protecting them? Right now, we still don't have equal pay, ladies. And it depends on your race as well, unfortunately. As a white woman, I'm relatively privileged. I earn about 80 cents on a man's dollar. If you're African American, you earn less, and if you're Hispanic, you earn, I believe, about 56 cents to a white man's dollar. And this is, it's unfortunate, and to some extent, it does to some extent result from the occupations that we are segregated into, but that's not all self-chosen, and it doesn't entirely result from that. If we have a statement of purpose in our United States Constitution explaining that we really believe in essentially equal opportunity without regard to our sex, that will be very helpful, I think. Okay, sorry, I strayed, but I think the thing is to not talk about. We just can't talk about party. It's an issue of people. And as a Republican member of the Fairfax Board of Supervisors, he made a few great points at our legal symposium. He said, you know, when our Declaration of Independence was passed, that was a radical document back then. It imagined a world where we could have a government based upon individuals, not based upon being, I apologize, preordained by God, but based upon our own merits. All of us pulling together as one, we would have our churches supporting us. We would have our institutions of faith there, along for the ride. But really, this was a country where we could have a government of men like George Washington, who had his first term, and then he stepped down. You know, this was radical at the time. So maybe it's radical to think that women as well could be included in all of this great equality. But maybe we've come to the point in society where we've reached the modern age. Some of the Supreme Court decisions in recent years seem to indicate that they treat women as equal under the law. So let's just get it there. Yes.
So like in Congress, if a bill gets stuck in committee, they can file a discharge petition. Does that apply to houses too? So like you were talking about, if it gets like sent to that one committee, it'll like die a sad pathetic death. But could they, if they have the votes in like the House or the Senate, could they just file a discharge petition? I can speak English.
It's a great question. It is a great question, and you're absolutely right, and they could. However, it's considered horribly rude.
This is Virginia.
And I know that sounds hilarious, but we don't want to do it that way. It's almost considered, you know, like violating the leadership's rights. We don't want to, we're going to need Congress to be able to come up with some nonpartisan solution. We want both parties on board enthusiastically. And so it's considered in the very courteous world of Virginia politics, it's considered a rather brutal way to do it. So unfortunately, we can't. But great question. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the content of the ERA? Meaning, does it cover economic, social, political, and cultural rights? Does it cover reproductive rights? What does it have in it when it says equal rights?
That's a great question. So you remember on the first slide, do you remember the button, equality of rights under the law? I mean, that's the ERA right there. So it's equality of rights under the law. Legal rights. Do men have a right to an abortion? I don't think so. Do men have a right to get the pill? Really, it wouldn't help them not have babies, you know? So what do they have a right to? Culturally, and in other ways, sometimes they're just biologically different from us. So it would be hard to argue they have a right to X, so we have an equal right. It is certainly a fear of a lot of people. It is absolutely a fear. And once again, I don't know the answer. It's going to go to the courts. It's going to go to the courts and we will find out. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as I think most people in this movement are concerned, what we would like are the rights that are there in the Constitution. Our rights under the Constitution. Only the Constitution is the Constitution. It's our founding document, and we deserve a place in it. That's all I can say.
So the standard is what men have, and we're asking for women to have what men have. Is that how it is?
I think it's heightened review, right? It's heightened scrutiny.
We would like heightened scrutiny under the law, and we would like heightened scrutiny of discriminatory laws and rules. So if the government acts in a way that is discriminatory, in some cases it has a very good reason to do so. Because again, men and women are biologically different. There may be a good reason for a particular law. I don't want free prostate exams. I mean, I just don't, you know. And there may be some things that men don't want, you know, ovarian subsidies of some sort. I don't know. There are certain things where we're just generally different. We're just looking based on sex. And it's hard for me to see how we could demand equal rights in this context. Some people might argue for it. And it has been argued for. There's all kinds of crazy court cases out there. If you look among the 50 states, lawyers have tried to make a lot of arguments. But I keep coming down to the fact that in Virginia, we have an equal rights amendment. Under our state constitution, we have the same rights that men do, and it has not led to any crazy consequences. Why? I think it's because our courts here are very rational. And I think our judiciary was very careful. And I think that when we pass the ERA, the judiciary throughout the country is going to be super careful. Because they'll know that any cases that they decide may be brought up to the Supreme Court. So I think they'll be cautious, and I think we'll get good precedents. Yes?
Well, as a proponent of the ERA, what do you view as the biggest problem with it? Not passing it, but the biggest shortfall or problem or that it might create by passing it?
I think it's going to create some temporary turmoil. We're going to have all these court cases. That's the biggest issue I can see, quite honestly. And then after that, I can only see benefit, frankly. But there will be a temporary period of time where there will be some unknowns. And there will be people caught up in litigation trying to find the right answers. And there will be some people who are really wedded to the status quo and will be upset. I think I think the majority of the country will not. In fact, the majority of the country wants the Equal Rights Amendment, and most people are shocked that it didn't pass, and they didn't even realize that. If you go out and poll people, about 3/4 of people think we have an Equal Rights Amendment, and more than 90% of people, depends on the poll, 93%, 96%, want us to have an Equal Rights Amendment. It's very popular. People in America do believe, generally, that men and women should have equal rights. It's just where we are as a country right now. You've already had a question. Maybe we'll get another one. We'll see how much time we have.
Do you know of any cases in Virginia that
that have come up under the Virginia Equal Rights Amendment? In other words, what rights have women in Virginia gotten because of that Virginia?
I am not an expert on the Virginia jurisprudence, although there are people who are. There were cases, I think back in the 1980s, but none of them, I think, created great hubbub or problems. I think there was mainly just one case testing it, and it did remain as part of the Constitution. But I don't know the other cases, and I'd have to ask one of my colleagues. I apologize for that. But I can get back to you on that.
So it hasn't made much of a difference really in Virginia.
It hasn't made much of a difference in Virginia, but mainly the issues that we're facing are federal. So, and some other states have much more backward laws than we have in Virginia. I see one way in the back. You're going to have to come forward because I need help.
Can everyone hear me? All right, cool. So what would the ratification of the ERA mean for court cases of custody in the future? Child custody?
That is a great question. Like everything else. Don't have a definitive answer. But mainly, actually, a lot of the kinks in child custody cases have been worked out. And in fact, some of the cases that were brought in order to try and remedy our laws were to ensure that men would also have child custody rights. Because actually still in some areas, women got an automatic preference, and that didn't seem really fair to fathers, understandably. I think that the Equal Rights Amendment might help even more in some areas with that leveling, but many areas have already sort of addressed that issue, which is essentially a problem, which is, again, we should treat all people, with respect, and in some cases, the father is going to be perhaps a better parent than the mother. It just depends on the individual circumstances, and a judge should be looking at that. Yeah.
This is the low question.
Can everyone hear her?
Yeah, I have no problem speaking up. So, if it passed right now, like we wake up tomorrow and we have this done,
Yes.
what would we notice different? Like, how would anyone's life be different tomorrow?
Well, my friend who was on that panel is going to be bringing some cases against some very backward laws in a few states, which thankfully are not Virginia. But there are some laws still on the books which are quite discriminatory. And she actually asked us not to list them in our talks because she doesn't want to give a heads up to the jurisdictions where she's planning to sue. However, so I apologize because everyone's asking me for specific case examples, and I'm not giving them, but that's intentional. But there will be some laws in some states that could be overturned under the ERA because they are unfairly discriminatory and classified based on sex rather than based on attributes which a person might have.
One of the main concerns we have today that's bubbling on the surface is the possibility of people together to try and repeal Roe versus Wade. Would passing the ERA provide a bulwark against this happening?
I know that both sides are going to be arguing it in court, and it's a very real question and concern for a lot of people. It's critically important, and I think that there will be attorneys going to court on both sides. But if you look at the Supreme Court that we have right now, I'm not sure they're necessarily going to change their minds on Roe versus Wade and what they think of it based on whether we have an ERA. I think they already know that that case was decided based upon privacy rights and self-determination rights. We had no ERA. And so Roe versus Wade, essentially, it's already on the books, and it was not based on an Equal Rights Amendment. So you don't need an equal rights argument to have that case law outcome. There's going to have to be something different that would happen to change the outcome of Roe v. Wade, because privacy rights are not affected by the ERA, and self-determination rights are not affected by the ERA. It would be its own amendment. based upon essentially non-discrimination, a right against non-discrimination. So I don't think it would change things. Personally, I don't think it would change things either better or worse. I don't think it's going to change things one way or another. As an attorney, this is just my personal opinion, and there will be attorneys arguing both sides. But again, it was passed based upon privacy rights and self-determination rights. It was no valid ERA at that time, had not been fully ratified, and so I think it probably will not affect it. But I understand the concern. Yeah. So it is going to create litigation. Remember, I talked about the turmoil. There's going to be litigation. I think we're just going to have to hold on for the ride, and I think we'll come out the other end with greater women's rights and hopefully not affecting other values that we care about deeply. Okay, you, and then.
Hi, I have a question because I'm an immigrant originally from Ethiopia, so I had assumed that like in the US this would have already been law, so like it didn't really for me. And I grew up in Ethiopia, I came for college here, so I've raised a family here. So what would be a reason why somebody wouldn't support it? And I was shocked that, like you said, like some states, they rescinded it. What justification would somebody give for something that seems so basic and fair to me? And like in Ethiopia, like, you know, it's in Africa, and they've been struggling like to have women's equal rights, but recently the Prime Minister was like in the Washington Post and all over. For the first time, he appointed the first like woman president in Africa. It's kind of a little symbolic, but she's very educated. And also, like the Supreme Court president is a woman, a lawyer, a judge. And half his cabinet are women. So like when I hear this, that it's not in the US, like it's shocking for me. What reason would people give? Like what justification for it not to be, not at all. So I'm just surprised that's so.
Well, it's funny, as a lawyer, I feel super powerful because I think they're afraid of the lawyers. I think they really are afraid, you know, that it will affect reproductive or social issues, gender equality in, you know, the full spectrum of gender or reproductive rights. I think there's a lot of fear. The difficulty is, to me, I see all of this hypothetical fear, and I understand that lawyers are very powerful creatures who are amazing at arguing, get that. But on the other side, I see women who are not treated as full citizens under our Constitution, which to me is insane and hilarious. Like, how can this be? I feel the same disconnect as I think you do. This is the greatest nation on earth. At least many people want to preserve that vision that we have of it. How can we not have women as fully equal citizens? And to me, that's a greater issue. Is what are we telling our daughters? You know? I understand there are a lot of fears, but I think those fears probably will not come to pass. I can't say definitely, probably. But on the other hand, we have a full, you know, do we want another generation of people being told that they don't have equal rights? That to me is just very harmful. And to not receive equal rights means they have less ability to defend themselves against discrimination, which comes sometimes in the form of violence, not just economic injustices. There's another woman in our coalition who, I'm not going to go into detail, but basically she suffered a great deal of violence, and she was not able to have full recourse in court. And there are certain precedents out there which, if we had an equal rights amendment, she actually would have greater force to the statutes that she was trying to use to explain what her attacker had done to her. So there are cases in which it's going to be helpful to people just to have a general principle of equal rights under law. Yes.
Will the ERA do anything to address the pay inequity?
I certainly hope so. So we do have the Little Life Better Fair Pay Act, which is a big step forward, and that's helpful. There was an Equal Pay Act before that, which a lot of women's rights activists were not super happy with because it involved some compromises that they felt made it less helpful. We still have a ways to go, and the Equal Rights Amendment will make it easier to go to Congress, go to state legislatures, and argue for additional pay equity where there are specific concerns. We will have an underlying principle on which we can say, on this basis, we have this justification, we have this great principle that our country believes all people should have essentially equal opportunities against discrimination. So it will give us an additional backing argument, essentially. It's not going to wave a magic wand. We're going to have to then take it and use it, but it can be helpful. Okay, several in the back. Do you want the mic?
I probably have a voice. Under the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies were prohibited from discriminating in terms of rates between men and women. That prior to that, insurance companies were allowed to charge women more than men because they might get pregnant or blah, blah, blah. And so I'm just wondering, under this, if the Affordable Care Act does get overturned by the Supreme Court, whether this act would then, protect women from discrimination in insurance. And also, like Trump already has allowed association health plans and short-term health plans to discriminate between men and women in terms of their rates. And I'm wondering if passing this would then, disallow those plans from discriminating against women. I don't know, because they are private companies, they're getting federal subsidies. I don't know.
Right. There would definitely be arguments that because the federal subsidies exist, that somehow they're a government actor, especially if it's under something akin to the Affordable Care Act, which essentially is a government program. And I think that people will use it, again, they'll use it as an argument. And so I can see how insurance companies might be a little concerned. On the other hand, if they're allowed to have rates that compensate them for having to equalize, then yeah, it could definitely be an issue. And I'm not going to say it might not be. There will be attorneys out there making that argument, but it's not going to be instant, and it's not necessarily going to come about. Back to litigation I talked about. I can't help it. Almost every answer is I'm not sure, but yes.
I think Whitaker, who replaced Sessions, said something about he wants to have biblical law.
He wants to have what?
Biblical law, biblical oversight in his position.
So not an ERA fan.
Exactly. And so how do you change, is there any hope of changing minds of people who want to live by the Bible as opposed to our Constitution?
I think you can live by both. And I think that some of the very best people of the cause do. But there are people who have a view that the Bible requires patriarchy. There are many people who don't, and that's why, in some religions you may have greater roles for women or more participation and just more equitable treatment. I think, there's some churches, like the Mormon Church has excommunicated people for being ERA activists. But then you have plenty of churches that are interested in listening or even advocating for it. There's nothing we can do about people's deeply held religious beliefs except to talk to people who are willing to listen and to ask them, what would you do if you were in our shoes? And how would you feel? And is this right? Women get grades that are as good as or better than men. Women are graduating universities at rates that are as good as or better than men. They tend to stay in and not drop out. And basically, the world has changed. They're an enormous part of our workforce, and many of them do it in high heels with children. It's amazing to me. But we should recognize this reality and try and support women as well as men. That's what I think. Yes.
Of the remaining states, how active are they in pursuing this?
We are right now racing against North Carolina, ladies and gentlemen. And I think we're going to win. But Arizona, distinct possibility. There's some other states that are definitely looking at it. But I think it's between us and North Carolina. That's where I think the real competition is. I think we can beat them. Working very hard. Fine stretch.
But it would be better if we had 3 or 4. Instead of just, or 3 or 4 more instead of just the one.
Oh, they were as close as us
Yeah,
getting it passed?
I would give up being first and 38 to being one of 41.
Yes, well, it would be great, but I'm just happy to be in a state that's this close. I think we can feel the momentum when I think it's here.
Practical question. You mentioned that on the House side that we want one committee, but then on the Senate side we want a different committee. Is there concern that because of that discrepancy that someone will come and say, well, you got 3 privileges and elections on the House side, why do you want to go to rules on the Senate side or vice versa? I can't remember
No, and here's why. In this past session, on the Senate side, they signed it to rules, and on the House side, they signed it for rules and elections. And we want them to do the opposite. So it's okay. It's going to be fine. They've already done it. They've set the precedent.
They've already
It happens.
themselves, so they can't now. Okay.
Right.
But is our asking, or getting friends to ask the Republican delegates or Congress people, is that going to get the committee assignment different? I mean, or does it have to be something more targeted to get the sending the bill to the right committee?
So we basically would like it if everyone could reach out to their own state lawmakers. Everyone has a state delegate and a state senator, and that would not be Tim Keene or Mark Warner. So whoever your state delegate and your state senator are, reach out to them. In Northern Virginia, most people are very supportive of the ERA, almost uniformly. But it's good to reach out and find out what their position is and tell them if you support it. That will help strengthen their position again because they can tell others how many people contacted them. But then if you have friends in other parts of the state, I don't care what area of the state it is, ask them to do the same. Because in every area, if they have an ERA supporter who are their members of the state legislature, you are helping support their votes. If they have an opponent, it's helping to let them know that their constituents don't agree, and they're there to represent their constituents. Doesn't matter what party they are and what party you are. They're there to represent us, and when they hear from us, they're more likely to do as we're asking, right? That's the whole principle behind some of these new movements, is they're contacting their lawmakers a lot. Why? Because they know that the lawmakers respond to that. They're interested. They want to